Good morning, everyone. Thanks for hanging out with us. We're running a little behind, but man, if you were on for that virtual opening coffee chat, what a powerful, powerful story. And so we're really grateful to be continuing our conversation with y'all this morning. I am Crystal Garcia, and I am the training coordinator here at TASA. And I will turn over the mic to my co-presenter here.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Madison Jackson and I'm a prevention specialist here at TASA. Thank you so much for joining us. So we'll go ahead and get started. But before we do anything, before we even go through this material, the first thing we really want to do is have a moment of gratitude and honor for all of the folks who really helped lay down so much of the groundwork and so much of the emotional labor, so much of everything in themselves to get us where we are today. The reason why we can be in this virtual room together, sharing this wisdom and sharing all of these experiences. So specifically the top row, you'll see not all, but some few key folks who are a part of the queer movement and starting some of the first LGBTQ plus experiences that we are able to have today, like whether it's from starting Pride or whether it's like just being themselves and being out in the open. On the bottom row, you'll see some folks who are specifically women of color that we owe so much to our movement as the anti-sexual violence movement. So I also want to give a shout out to my co-presenter, Crystal, and my gratitude for her is that she is the one who really was the big brain behind this and invited me to be a co-presenter. And I want to thank Crystal for that. So also just, want to give her gratitude for her brain and everything like that. So yeah.
Yes, and I think for me, just same thing, Madison. I'm also on the conference planning committee, so a lot of this stuff couldn't have been done without Madison jumping in and helping us get to this presentation. And I think grounding myself in the lessons that I've learned, that if I'm great, it's because I rest on the shoulders of a lot of amazing advocates and people who brought me into this work and have nurtured me and reminded me and checked my ego when I've needed it for the last 20 years. So I just send all my gratitude to them as well. So
yes. And gratitude to all of you for being here. Thank you for being willing to join us.
All right, so we're just going to do a little bit of background and introduction on us, and then we will get into our content. Like I said, I am Crystal. I am the training coordinator here at TASA. I've been in this role about 2 years now. Been with the organization for 3. I worked at the local level before that, and I started working with survivors as a peer educator and peer advocate in 2000. I will let you do the rest of that math. And I have training in substance abuse counseling. I've worked with incarcerated survivors of sexual violence who are also struggling with a substance use disorder. I specialize in equity and inclusion training, leadership training, and then just basic dynamics of sexual assault training. And think about anything else. So I do live and work for TASA in San Angelo. So I do a lot of work with rural communities as well. And I'm really passionate about mentoring survivor leaders and this particular topic. So.
Yeah. And for me, Madison, she, her, hers, I will definitely say that, so my entrance into this movement is not only as a survivor, but as a prevention person. If you are also in the prevention field, you know that it is so much fun and it's also a lot of work. But I will also say I am so grateful to be doing this today because working within communities, specifically with queer young folks who have taught me so much and have been in community with me and everything. I just want to give a shout out to them and say that most of my work and my study has been in the realm of gender studies, as well as, specifically around sexual violence, a lot of my work and research. So I guess I will leave it there, but
Absolutely. All right, let's get into this session.
Yes.
So All right, so we just want to lay a little bit of groundwork and framework for what we hope that you walk away from today's content with. And so we're going to really focus in on two areas today. And our first is to really identify and define biphobia, the bi plus spectrum for survivors. And this is incredibly important. And we want you to walk away with this information because it is directly connected through research, and there's a correlational relationship between our understanding of these terms and disclosures. So this directly impacts direct services with survivors. So it's really, really important we understand what we are actually having these survivors disclose to us when we are directly working with them. And then our second objective and our second goal is for you today is for you to be able to walk away with the ability to identify at least three, we hope more, but at least three needs that are incredibly unique for this specific community of survivors, because their needs are not necessarily different, but they are incredibly unique in terms of the space that they are looking for to be able to disclose and to be able to get the right services that they need. So.
Yes, so thank you. We'll go ahead and get started into the material. Specifically today, since we are talking about bi plus folks, and we'll go a little bit more into that, we won't go into hyper detail about the full, spectrum of folks, including like sexuality and gender identity, but we did at least want to put the acronym out there that most of y'all may hear, and with a couple little updates. So just so you know, for LGBTQIA+, L is lesbian, G is gay, T is transgender, 2 is two-spirit, which is specifically used within Indigenous communities and only specifically for Indigenous queer folks, queer, intersex, asexual, and the plus is attempting and aspiring to be inclusive of all other identities that maybe, we're growing and expanding. We're always learning how to make sure that everyone is included. And something I will say that I think is the most beautiful thing about, the queer community is that we are always finding new ways to, beautifully explain ourselves and other, parts of our community. And so that's why the plus is there, is to make sure that it is open to current and future growth. So with that, let's talk a little bit more about bisexual. So that is the B in the acronym. So bisexual for us today, we're going to use a definition of attraction to more than one gender. This attraction could be physical, romantic, and or emotional. Bisexual people may experience different kinds of attraction to different genders, and their attractions may change over time. So the reason why we say bi plus is because a lot of the times there is this stereotype that bisexual folks are only specifically attracted to cisgender women and cisgender men, but we know the beauty of the queer community is that there are so many expansive ways that someone can be attracted to people. So bisexual is just more of an expansive way of saying that it can be based on emotions, sexuality, gender, all of those things. Oh, thank you. Okay, yes. So that's why we say bi plus. So you can say bisexual or bi plus. So for bi plus, we're saying it's an umbrella term that includes all people who experience any kind of attraction to more than one gender. So it's all the way around. Since we are going to be talking about biphobia and bi erasure, we also wanted to give some definitions and maybe some examples of how this maybe can show up. So for biphobia, we're going to define it today as an aversion towards bisexuality and bisexual people. So it's based on negative stereotypes or irrational fear. This manifests in both hetero and queer communities. So whenever we say that last part, that we see it in both hetero and queer communities, there is a big stereotype and stigma that bi plus folks are just not out yet, or that they specifically are just experimenting with people. And so there's a lot of people even within the queer community who don't always see validity in bisexual or bi plus identity. So we'll go a little bit more into that in a bit. So that's just something to consider also when it comes to the needs of bi plus survivors. So some of those ideas or stereotypes that might add into biphobia are things like they're just super promiscuous. They just want to have sex with everybody, and that they're not really going off of love. There's also a stereotype that they have the inability to remain committed or monogamous, that they're always cheating, that there's no way they could be in a monogamous relationship. And also the inability to be satisfied unless one is with both male and female partners simultaneously. So this thought that bi plus folks are never going to be satisfied unless they are either polyamorous or specifically that they're always looking for threesomes. And so with that being said, as long as it's consensual, hey, awesome. But unfortunately, sometimes those can actually be used against bi folks to discriminate against them in the hetero and queer community. Okay, I just want to check in really quick with the interpreters. Thank you so much for the signal to slow down. I want to check in. Is the pace a little bit better? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Also want to give gratitude, forgot to on that slide, for our interpreters today. Thank y'all so much for being a part of this workshop and for your work in here. So thank you for that signal. Do not hesitate to keep telling us to slow down. So the next term, bi erasure. So this is where bi folks are completely removed from any possibility or intention and services or in the thought around even just that they're a part of the queer community. So the bi erasure definition that we'll use today is that it is intentional and unintentional attempts to invalidate the bisexual label and community. So some ways that we see this happening is maybe expecting any bisexual person to come out as actually straight or gay or lesbian, that there's no way that they could actually be attracted to multiple folks, that like, oh, you just haven't come out yet. So erasing their full spectrum of attraction and love. Assuming when a bisexual person has a partner that the bisexual person is now gay or straight and no longer bisexual, that it has to be one or the other, that binary. So the last one is using the adjective gay or same gender, or for same gender, as in gay marriage instead of marriage equality or marriage. So once again, sometimes we see where maybe it is a cis woman who is married to a cis man, but maybe the cis man is bisexual and has had relationships in the past with other men identified folks that, oh, they're straight now, or they're really gay and they're just married to a straight woman kind of thing. We know that that is not the case, but there are many folks who still have that stereotype in their head about that. So the last, there's two more, my bad. So the next term that we're going to talk about is fetishization, which is a big word, forgive me. But with that, it's this fetishizing of bi folks. And I actually learned from Crystal recently this concept of unicorn hunting. And I think, that's something that she can go into later, but it's that fetishization where, we really want to almost like pursue them for their sexual identity. So it can be the reduction of bi plus people to aspects of their body, identity, or relationship structure. So specifically looking at their sexuality first before their humanness. So some ways that we see this fetishization is hypersexualized stigmas and stereotypes that, once again, they're completely promiscuous. They want sex all the time. They're just a very sexual person, which once again, with consent, awesome. but not every single bi plus person is going to be a sexual person in the way that we assume. Using bisexuality in media and pornography as a way of voyeurism for straight people. Honestly, to be very frank, it's usually for straight cis men that, honestly, we see it most often with women to women identified folks, kissing, having sex, but using that bi idea that they could be, with multiple partners and multiple different people for this voyeuristic way of our own appeal, but without consent. And then the last bullet on that is treating bisexuality as an event meant for observation rather than a legitimate sexual orientation, perpetuating harmful stereotypes and reducing an individual's identity to only their sexual history. So once again, reducing it down to the sexualization, not the person, and the complexity of their relationships, and all of those things. So what we're hoping today, the last term for y'all, is we're hoping to give some bi visibility, specifically bi survivor visibility. And the reason why visibility is so important is because it helps us understand each other more, and it also helps us understand maybe some of those gaps that we need to fill in when serving survivors so that when they're visible, they can be served. So bi visibility will say that it is efforts to increase awareness and acceptance of bisexuality as a sexual orientation. Bi visibility can be undertaken by bisexual individuals, bisexual communities, and allies who are not bisexual. So allies with invitation. So those are some of the terms you might hear us use, maybe a little bit more understanding around, bi plus experiences and survivorship in general. So I will pass it on to Crystal for that.
Right. So in my heart of hearts, where I am at my core is a public health scientist. So I am going to spend a little bit of time connecting some of these dots here with some math and some statistics. And I remember as an advocate, for me, when I talk about numbers, I'm very passionate about them, but they're not just numbers for me, they're also stories. These are also survivors who have graciously allowed me as an advocate the opportunity to walk through certain journeys with them as they find their own stories and their own journey to empowerment. So it's a combination, and I hope that is something that is comes across in this particular discussion about statistics and numbers, because this particular group of people is very lost in the services that we provide. About 1%. And let me say that one more time so you can fully hear that number. 1% of dollars, of grant dollars that are spent to serve the LGBTQIA plus community, only 1% of those dollars are actually used to assist people from this particular community. But as I break this down, we will see that 61% of survivors are identifying as bisexual women. And what they are finding is they're having no place to fall. So I don't know about you, Madison, but yesterday after conference, and we haven't been in conference space for about 2 years now. We all got to do this at home in our flip-flops, and I put my good shoes back on. Man, my feet were tired, and I was so excited to come to my room and just take all these work clothes off and sit in that beautiful hotel bed and just let it go, right? And so for our survivors, who are 61% of our survivors who are identifying as bisexual women, they're not finding that safe place to fall. They're being turned away from advocacy services, not always understood in advocacy services. And then also in their LGBT community, they're also being turned away there, right? So where? And that's the biggest concern, is where. And that matters because when we talk about the health outcomes for survivors and what happens next after they've been exposed and humiliated in this way, what happens next for them? We talk about their quality of life from a public health perspective, and we understand from the advocacy perspective, sexual assault doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? One sexual assault has a ripple effect. And the reason that we are so passionate when we say one incident, one act of sexual violence is too many, because it affects all of us as a community. It affects all of us as a state, and it has this rippling outcome for someone. And so this connects back to the dehumanization, because that's where sexual violence lives. That's how sexual violence starts, is I no longer see a person who is causing harm, no longer sees a person as a human thing that they can harm. It is a thing, a person becomes a thing to do something to. And if I don't have a place in any community to talk about that, to explore that, a safe place to fall, so to speak, like that wonderful hotel bed that I found after a long day yesterday. A person who has experienced harm, the survivor, is going to find a way to cope with that. And for many, many, many survivors, I talk about disproportionate amounts of survivors, they are going to find it in unhealthy coping mechanisms. And those unhealthy coping mechanisms are going to simultaneously save their life and cause harm, right, to themselves and to other people around them. So this 61% of people and this 37% of bisexual men, but we're focusing on women for this particular content because these rates are so high. They are going to experience higher rates of anxiety, depression, mood disorders. So how are we going to cope with that? Our brain is going to naturally want to fight to get back in balance. Substance abuse, self-harm through cutting, self-harm through disordered eating. They're going to have lower levels of social support, right? So not being able to go in, but when I do find a provider that might be able to help me, I might have to do something to get that help, like lie about my lived experience, lie about who I am, lie about the gender of the person that caused me harm. Well, if I do that, if a person does that, now I'm not going to look like a credible or that fit into that narrative of the perfect survivor. So if I have told law enforcement any misinformation, now I could be subject to being penalized for false report, right? So this creates such a rippling effect for the survivor. 96% of people who identify as bisexual have trouble sleeping, right? So when we can't sleep, that's all sorts of other health outcomes. And we're going to be looking for medical providers and things to help us. But if they're not trained and they can't talk about these things with us, we might not be getting the proper care. So many, many BIS survivors go from organization to organization to organization, looking for the right kind of help. And sometimes by the time they get to an advocacy program or a counseling program, they've had multiple treatment attempts, multiple counseling attempts. And so they get labeled with this idea that they're not trying hard enough, that it's on them. And so they're constantly reinforced with the message of brokenness, right? We're looking at communities that are facing higher rates of sexual harassment, higher rates of poly-victimization, intimate partner violence, low self-esteem, which also connects back into the mood disorders, and then higher rates of poverty and all of these things. So ultimately, the reason that we're concerned and we want to kind of sound the alarm on how and ask questions about how we're serving this group of people is because we lose community members. Ultimately, we lose parents, we lose partners, we lose just a contributing person because they just aren't finding their place, right? They just don't have the safe place to fall. So you click for me. All right, and so the societal impact, and this connects bigger. The reason that bisexuals, female identified survivors experience higher rates of these things and they're often not helped is because we still found in some peer-reviewed articles that 18 to 31% of people still believe the stereotype that this particular group of survivors are inherently hypersexual. They're often misdiagnosed in the counseling realm, and that plays out if they have court cases or custody, or actually, they're on the off chance their case makes it to a courtroom, this particular stigma is used against them and somehow discredits them, is that this behavior that was harmful and humiliating was somehow inadvertently or overtly invited because of who they are, and because of the type of relationships that they keep. So the incredible rates of victim blame. And we often look at victim blame from the perspective of the community. But unfortunately, and one of the things that we as advocates have to be called to the table on is not only are you experiencing victim blame from your community, you can also experience it when you go in for advocacy services. And that can happen with other groups of people too, but this is the highest group that's experiencing it. And so it's really important for us as ourselves as advocates, because it's not the victim's responsibility to teach us who they are. We get to do this work, we choose to do this work. And so it's our responsibility to call ourselves to that higher standard, to understand and to provide better quality care. So all right. So again, additionally, research has also found, and when I talk about the correlational relationship, this means that people who identify as bi survivors, when they talk about their quality of care and they talk about their lived experience and their quality of health and wellness, we found there are two things that really impact this, right? And it has this push-pull effect, because bi survivors are often kind of seen as these people in the middle and waiting to get to another point in their life. So they face higher rates of hypersexualization and stigma. These two things work together, unfortunately, to create a negative loop for these survivors. And it's just this constantly reinforcing idea. So even an advocate who's informed and trained, when we say things like, it is not your fault, right? That's a really common saying that we use in advocacy because of this impact, the strong impact of hypersexualization and stigma that was probably already there before the first act of sexual violence that they experienced, the first act of harassment. That statement hits just a little differently. And it takes maybe just a little longer to move from the logic in the brain to that place in the heart where survivors really find that sense of healing, right? And so we have to say it over and over and over again. And we just, I've found sometimes as an advocate getting frustrated, just believe me when I say this. But we also have to consider that this is a long pattern of thinking that a survivor can carry with them, and often happening well before they might be coming in for help. Do you want to add anything to this cycle?
So no, I think that was perfect. Yes, the cycle and how it just continues to go down the spiral, because they all feed into each other. Totally agree with. And so thank you so much, Crystal, for all of that. So now we can kind of talk about how this can present barriers to survivors who are bi plus, like how they actually can have barriers within our care as well as other services that they might need. Because just like Crystal said earlier, safety planning, services, those things are going to need to be very specific for bi survivors for different reasons. So just like Crystal also said, there are such high rates of victim blaming within the communities against bi survivors, because once again, stereotypes of promiscuity and fetishized myth that, oh, maybe you actually just didn't want that threesome. And so, or maybe now you regret it. And so you're saying that maybe it's sexual assault kind of thing, or just the thought of, well, isn't that what you want? Isn't that what y'all do kind of idea, not believing that someone could experience sexual assault while being a bi survivor. Also, there's this concept, especially in the queer community, around bi plus privilege, specifically kind of like how I gave an example earlier, Say that it is someone who is a cis man who is in a relationship with a cis woman, that because they are in a straight appearing marriage or relationship, that they are completely safe. And to be honest, there is some reality to that, that if we are a bi person and we are in a relationship that is straight appearing, people, it's not as much of a signal to folks who are against LGBT folks. And so it can be some thought of a protection, but in reality, even in those relationships, even with a bi person, even if they are straight appearing, we know that bi relationships also experience higher rates of interpersonal violence and domestic violence. So it's one of those things where it's a complex barrier because we have all of these victim blaming ideas like no one is going to believe me, or I am in a straight appearing relationship, so it probably looks like I'm not bi kind of thing. There's also, just like with so many survivors, a fear of reporting. Just like Crystal said so amazingly, will someone know how to help, like me specifically, but also feeling like they have to lie about their situation, maybe lie about how they might be in a relationship, saying that they're roommates or friends kind of thing, which is so common for so many queer survivors, but definitely also with bi survivors. And we know for a fact they're not lying about the sexual violence, but they might have to, change some details of that story, making it seem like their story isn't valid. Also, just like with so many folks in the queer community, there are fewer resources for bi folks. They might not know where to go. They might not know for sure if this person is trained specifically in serving them as a bi plus person, even at LGBTQ plus services. So we know that both of the sexual assault services that are for anyone and then specifically specialized for LGBTQ plus, we know that there might experience some harm there. Also, family and friends might not know that they are in the queer community. They might not be out to everyone. So that's the other thing too, is that to receive services, also as a queer identified person, a lot of the times you feel like you have to out yourself. So just definitely making sure that we are aware of how they might need to be supported as bi plus specifically. So also, once again, higher rates of abuse in all categories. It's a phenomenon that so many people aren't studying, aren't talking about, and whether it's IPV, sexual violence, domestic violence, sexual harassment, all of these things, we see that bi women specifically are experiencing this at the highest rates. The last category of barriers is the community connection. So lack of support from their own communities. So we have seen so many times, survivor or not, when someone comes out as bi, that people, even within the queer community, don't believe that it's valid. So they don't know who they can go to. So how does this impact our work? How does this look within our work? So for us, we have to think of what that survivor is experiencing and then how it impacts specifically our numbers, because those numbers have people behind them. So for us, we see that there is less reporting and multiple victimizations for a bi plus survivor. So not only, like Crystal said, the poly victimization. So maybe that is they have experienced domestic violence and sexual violence and other types of violence, but also multiple sexual assaults, multiple experiences of sexual violence. So the multi-sexual or multi-victimization is a big one. And so because of that, a lot of the times you'll see in the outer ring that a survivor, if they are experiencing this, they have to go outside of their communities to receive support. And a lot of the times, that's like Crystal was saying, they turn inside themselves, maybe isolate, maybe turn to coping mechanisms that can present self-harm. Then safety planning for us as advocates, we have to consider that it needs to look different for bi plus survivors, whether it's considering a shelter, whether it's considering how we treat and speak to them in counseling, how we hear them during a SANE exam, how we document their victimization. All of these things need to be considered for bi plus survivors specifically. Also, once again, higher rates of victim blaming from all of these services. And then healing is prolonged. They chase the coping mechanisms that take longer for healing. And so they might also need to receive sexual violence counseling, as well as maybe substance abuse counseling, as well as housing, as well as all of these other systems that have to interact with each other to support this bi plus survivor. So it becomes a cycle that feeds into itself over and over and over again, leading more into the less reporting and multiple victimizations.
All right, so we are going to share some case studies with you. So if you want to take a little bit of notes, we're going to read them. And then we are going to kind of talk through some of the levels of community and relationships and look at some of these impacts, because all of these things are working together to create kind of the experience for the survivor. So if you will just take a minute to listen to our first situation, and then we are going to have some questions for you. And we will be using the interactive whiteboard. So we'll have a little bit of a technology switch while we work on this. So just give us a second, we'll set it right up.
Yes, I am trying to copy and paste the scenario in the chat box so that people can read it if needed. So give me one moment. For some reason, it won't copy.
Thank you so much, Madison and Crystal, for sharing. As a reminder, I just want to let anyone know, if you need support from an advocate, feel free to send me a private message here in Zoom, and I will get you connected with someone as soon as possible.
Scenario. We're skipping ahead to the second scenario.
Sorry.
All right, and technology fun, y'all. We're growing and learning. All right, so our first scenario, I'll just read to you. This is about Amy and Frankie. Amy and Frankie met in college and married shortly after. All right, and we're going to give a little time for our interpretation to keep up with us. Amy decided to throw a surprise birthday for her wife and met up with some college friends in a popular downtown area. The night is going well, and the couple and their friends are enjoying dancing and drinks. As the night progresses, the DJ announces that Frankie is celebrating her dirty 30 and invites the bar to celebrate with the group. A small group of people send over a round of shots from the bar, but the couple and their friends start to notice the group is staring at them. They wave to the group to say thank you, but the other group decides to walk over and join them. Frankie is very uncomfortable and tells Amy that she is getting hungry and would like to move to the late night food truck park. So people can, or would like to move to the late night food truck park a few blocks up the road. The city offers a commuter shelter in the downtown area so people can safely move to various downtown locations and catch the shuttle to get food. While on the bus, they notice a few of the men from the group who sent the shots have followed them out of the bar and have also boarded the bus. The group begins to call for Amy to kiss the birthday girl. The couple tries to play things off, but there is no way to exit the shuttle. Once the bus stops at the truck, the men follow them and continue to yell at them to kiss. They're able to surround the couple, and one person grabs Amy's shirt to lift it, and another person tries to push Frankie towards Amy so the two would kiss. The couple's friends has started to yell and is recording the situation on the telephone. Someone from the food truck park comes out and asks if everything is okay, and the men run in the opposite direction. Amy is unsure of what to do next and has called the hotline asking for support and resources. All right, so now we just want you all to think through some of the societal influences. When we talk about societal, those are the broad influences that could be occurring. Maybe some of the positive influences that could be helping in the situation, and as well as the negative. And then we kind of move this level. So society is abroad, and as these levels get closer, they get closer in terms of influence to the person. So the community level is next, and this might be the city and state around this person. And then the relationship level is the closest level to them, the people that are in their primary circle, and then the individual risk and protective factors that could be going on here. So. Yes.
So as you feel comfortable thinking of this story in particular, we would love for people to unmute or drop in the chat some of the dynamics you heard of how this was impacted on the societal, community, relationship, and individual level. We know that all of the levels were impacted. So what were some of the things you heard, some of the ways that these levels were impacted?
Can I try and take a stab at all the levels? Okay, so let me turn my camera on. For the societal level, well, I think just the fact that, you know, somebody didn't intervene sooner, right? Like people are just kind of like allowing it to happen or don't really intervene. And then at the communal level, somebody finally intervenes, the food truck person, the relationship level, well, in the relationship, and the friends, the group that they were with, and then the individual level, just like how it affected them personally. I can't remember now if it was Amy or Frankie who was feeling uncomfortable and wanting to leave the bar or restaurant in the first place. And, you know, even the shuttle, right? Like having access and the resources at the end of the scenario when they called, well, that could be also part of the societal level, was the resources that were available to them after, you know, the whole, the harm happened. And I'm sure there's things I'm missing, but that's my take right now.
You're welcome. Anybody else that would like to think through this or talk through it, or feel free to type in the chat and we can read it for you.
I will say, I think Alexis did a wonderful job of thinking of some of those dynamics. And so no pressure, but if folks also feel comfortable, maybe thinking also on the next level of what are those considerations as an advocate that we might need to consider. So us as advocates in this virtual room, what are some of the things you've already started to signal or think about?
Hi, my name is Ileana, and something that I was thinking of was the intersectionality, and I want, in a way, I want to keep it about the community we're talking about, but it's also hard to disconnect from other communities and other things that are happening. So I kind of saw it from a lens of intersectionality and thinking what has been happening with the abortion ban and how it has started. That makes me think that in a societal level, the over empowering who is already empowered and the entitlement that now that was reinforced with this belief that we are allowed to police each other, right? So from following that path and the way that that was done of like, you can sue other people if they're doing something, you know, like that path, the way that they did it with abortion, it scares me. And it's hard to separate that from this scenario. And again, I don't want to invalidate the specific needs and challenges from the community we're, you know, reviewing right now, but it kind of reminds me of that, like that over empowering and entitlement that, you know, people feel that just they can approach somebody else and based on their identity, they can represent a threat. Anyway, that's what came up for me, because I know that with everything that has happened with abortion, it's the fear of like, and in terms of advocacy, it doesn't end there, right? Like we know it's huge. And at the same time, we know that it's not just about abortion, right? That it can continue and how this is going to keep impacting other vulnerable communities. So this is a specific, very vulnerable community with those intersectionalities, and it made me think that way.
Any other? Okay, so and in terms of advocacy, one of the things that we kind of left open here was the response from the hotline. And would they know how to take a call like this? Because that's some hotlines might take a call like this, and some hotlines might inadvertently or unintentionally start to turn something like this away, because we often associate with services with some type of penetration, and that's not necessarily the case. So in Texas, we do have the anti-groping laws that could potentially protect people here. Sometimes for this particular community, there's some hesitance. Was this a hate crime, or was this a sexual assault? Or is it one of those situations where it's and both? And for most people in this community, it's an and both situation. But sometimes from the provider standpoint, there's a lot of passing around of, well, maybe, right? So we really want to be mindful of that. And so that's why we didn't really put an endpoint in terms of what happened after. Madison, do you want to talk about the hospital and what potential services they could get here? So
Yeah, absolutely. I do also want to point out something to consider. I want to appreciate the mention of, you know, everything surrounding abortion rights right now, because also if we know that BI+ survivors are really experiencing high rates of sexual assault, and we know that many of the people who are perpetrators are cis white men. We know that specifically they also would be at a very high risk of needing access to family planning, to options for what they are hoping to seek after maybe something happens. So I appreciate that. Also in the hospital, I think it's important to consider how whenever someone is a bi survivor, they specifically sometimes are seen as, not needing a rape kit or a SANE kit. In this case, to be honest, we would want to make sure that they know that they have right and access to a SANE kit, because many times people only provide that option whenever it is a penetrative sexual assault. But in this case, if someone was trying to remove that person's shirt, they could submit their shirt as evidence. They specifically could go to the hospital to make sure that there's no bruising, no cuts, no further contact, maybe DNA and evidence that could be used to specifically pursue the person who tried to rip off the shirt. So just know that that is also something that we might want to consider, is that it's not just sexual assault in one way, that it's an expansive definition. So in this case, with the survivor, they absolutely could have access and should be offered a SANE exam. So that's something to consider too.
Yes. Mhm. And then in terms of some of the protective factors that were also identified in here, this is a group that's a married couple, so the person can participate, but also as an advocate, we want to be mindful of if they're not in a situation, what can we disclose to the partner, and making sure that we're looking at that from a good perspective. And then we also talk about some of the prosocial relationships, how the friend was trying to help to the best of their ability to get that, filmed or yelling for help and things like that. So there were some prosocial interventions, but also, in terms of considerations and safety planning for loneliness, mental health, and things like that, being able to pull those protective factors in are some really great resources for this person as well. So, all right.
Yes, and I definitely also want to bring up the comment that Denise made specifically around saying, it is interesting, the sexualization of this event started with the DJ and Dirty 30. Should the situation have been stopped there? How would intervention at this point have changed what happened? So
that's a great, and I have an answer for that I'm thinking through, but I really would love to hear the rest of the group talk about that first. So it's not just one answer, because I think there are multiple perspectives on this. So anybody from the group want to unmute and talk through that with us?
Can you repeat the question?
So we are looking at how the hypersexualization and kind of the fetishizing, I have a really hard time with that word, y'all. It's an important word and I want to get it right, but how that started with the DJ, putting them kind of out there and putting their business out there, and had the intervention started with that DJ, or should there have been interventions with that DJ? Kind of open to discussion. So.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really thought-provoking question, because just the idea of Dirty 30, right? Like, what does that even mean? What are people talking about when they say Dirty 30, right? Anyway, that's something that I've actually thought about. And I think it also goes back to the societal level, right? How there is just this acceptance of yeah, it's a Dirty 30, right? There, nobody is really challenging that concept. It's kind of just widely accepted. So I think that's an interesting question, because, well, yeah, because I can see why somebody might not intervene, but I can see how it was problematic that they brought it up in the first place, so it's just really interesting. I'd be open to hearing what somebody else thinks too.
For me, the only thing I can think of is, and I'm part of a community education program. So I think in terms of like educating the community, raising awareness, like sharing information about communities that are particularly vulnerable, right? Just educating people to say, if you ever see somebody being targeted, even with something that could be taken as light or fun, or it's a joke, or it's just, a very superficial thing that you think is not going to have consequences, it could, right? It could escalate. It's kind of like already putting the first step in that path of violence towards a community that or an individual that we know is vulnerable, so it could easily escalate and get further away that maybe for other people. And so just maybe working with people, telling them, when you see something like that, you could be an upstander, you could do something that might be able to stop things, and preventing from escalating. So just somebody in the crowd could say like, hey, no, not that kind of joke, not that kind of comment. Just don't say that, that it's not too provoking, but that might help, to like realize, and for the DJ to like, okay, I won't go that way. I don't know, like just something that could help instead for things to like evolve in one direction.
Anyone else?
I had a thought, and I don't think anybody said it yet, but I'm wondering about the shuttle bus driver. Like, I would have kicked those guys off the bus. Like, if this was happening on the bus, this person was, Ileana just said upstander, like bystander. Like, what happened there?
Mhm.
That's really scary to think about.
And for bi survivors, one of those risk factors is a lot of their victimization typically occurs in places where there's a high rate of alcohol misuse, binge drinking and things going on. So often the interventions don't start because we assume it's just a bunch of drunk people acting dumb. And we don't put the label of sexual harassment on there. We don't call out that hypersexualization because everybody's just getting drunk. And all this behavior is actually connected to the poor, misunderstood drunk guy, right? So then there's another factor in there, and that often prevents survivors from speaking up too, because they think, well, we maybe we shouldn't have accepted those shots, maybe this, maybe that, right? But we're talking about people of age. And there's no necessarily that their group of friends and them were binge drinking or anything like that, but there is a strong tie with the high rates of victimization we see, where alcohol is part of that story some way, somehow. And unfortunately, the blame is often put on the survivor. What did they expect to happen? They expected a hangover. Like, let's be honest, right? They didn't expect a crime to be committed against them. So yeah. Do we want to read? There's some good chat coming in there. Yeah. I think there's some entitlement in the group that sent the drinks. This seemed like a quid pro quo sexual harassment. Yes, they sent drinks, so they believed they were entitled to seeing them kiss, right? There's a chance they sent drinks simply for that reason and to influence their judgment and all of those things, right? So alcohol is often used as an act of kindness, and kindness in the form of being able to manipulate your ability to consent. So,
and one thing I definitely also want to bring up with the hospital that I totally forgot was that because they sent shots over, another way or another thing to consider in sending them to the hospital is, what if they put something in the shots, making sure that they are safe, that if they have drugs in their system from something that someone may have put in the shot, that they are safe, they can be cared for if they have a bad reaction or response. And also that is something that can be collected as evidence, once again, in a forensic kit. And of course, that's only if they want to report. We know that there is less reporting, but just, once again, a big part of advocacy is all of the options. Something that I love to really talk about as a prevention person, always talking about consent, is that the UN defines consent, true consent, as being able to make a decision and say full yes based on knowing all consequences, both positive and negative. So with that being said, knowing all of the options is how we give them their power of consent back. So any last thoughts? I think I see Gabriela, maybe that you unmuted. So I want to check in to see if you want or have anything to say. No pressure if not. I'm sorry if I put you on the spot. I just wanted to make sure you had a chance. So thank y'all so much for your analysis. Everything was so wonderful.
Mhm.
All the dynamics you considered, all of the ways that you thought about those dynamics was wonderful. The reason why we did the lines the way we did is because on the societal level, thinking about they have a little bit of access to some resources, even the fact that they are married, and right now it is legally recognized for them to be married. If they did go to the hospital, it ensures and makes sure that the partner, the spouse, can go back to the back room with them. The staff can't argue with them. If they weren't married, we know that a lot of times they say family only, married only, things like that. And then on the community level, it was kind of medium because we saw that there were some people who did not stand in, like y'all said, the bus driver, but a food truck person did come out and help with the situation. With the relationship level, we did see that the friend tried their best to help and support. And also with the community, they did have a hotline. And lastly, for the individual piece, they did experience sexual harassment, sexual assault. Just like Crystal said, there is legal support also in Texas, that there is a law that helps put groping into a sexual violence, sexual assault category, a criminal category. So as an advocate, making sure that we are specifically trained to consider their needs. Do they always need public transportation? Did they take that shuttle because they also require public transportation? If public transit is triggering for them after this event, are there other resources we can consider for them? Knowing their legal rights and helping them access a SANE exam and reporting if wanted. So we'll go ahead and do our last scenario and then we'll be done. So let me pull that up and I'll make sure to go slowly so that we can have time for interpretation. So for our next scenario, it's up. So I will read it also. So Sam has been dating Brandon for 3 months now after meeting at her new job. And she thinks it is time to come out to him as a bi+ person. One night, they are out having dinner and talking about funny past relationship stories. She begins to go into a story about a woman she dated a year ago and how they went ice skating and she couldn't keep from falling the whole time. Brandon's face goes slack and he asks if she meant to say it was a story with an old friend. She explains that no, she is bisexual and has had past relationships with both men and women. Brandon goes quiet and they finish their dinner with few words between them. Once they get into the car to go home, Brandon starts yelling at Sam, saying how humiliating it was to have her talking about her past relationships with women in public, and that she should never have told him. He proceeds to yell at her, and they get home, and when they get home, he says that if he knew she was bi when they started dating, he never would have been with her for this long. Brandon tells her that he knows she is going to cheat on him and asks if she has already been cheating on him. She says no, and he tells her he is going to tell everyone at work that she is a lesbian tricking men into relationships, so no other guy at work will fall for it. He says they are done and leaves, slamming the door. He then texts her an hour later and says that he's going to make her regret humiliating him. Sam is scared he might come back to her apartment and hurt her. She also knows that Brandon could have pictures from sex they sent back and forth and is terrified he might send them to so many people or post them online. She is also not out at work and isn't sure if she will be safe in the workplace and if her boss will support her or fire her. If she loses this job, she doesn't know what she will do and if she can find another one in time to pay rent or maybe even move to a new apartment. So similar to the last scenario, what are some of the dynamics of the different levels that were impacted, so on and so forth? Feel free to unmute or drop in the chat.
Quiet group.
Any thoughts on some of the needs you already see popping up for the survivor, for you as an advocate?
Yeah, I think of the whole aspect of the revenge porn, because he said that's one of her fears that he might utilize against her. And unfortunately, sometimes there could be some protections, but some things are not. Specifically, if he's able to, in a way, hide the fact he's the one sharing it, if they can't trace it back to him.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you so much for mentioning that. And also to further support what you're saying, Kayla, is that as of right now, there are no laws that protect adults from revenge porn, non-consensual imagery sharing. So that is something to consider. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yes, adults and people under 17 are protected differently. So
I guess also the stigma, because like I said, she's not out at work, and that anxiety and fear she has of losing, in a way, like a safety net she has, because that's her option when and how she chooses to come out to a place of employment. And unfortunately, some places, you know, we all know people hate, people are ugly, people are mean, and they could it could cause her to lose her job for all we know.
Absolutely. And we know that it is legal to fire someone for being LGBTQ+. We know that that is a valid legal reason. It's not actually valid, but you know. Yes, also, Keandra saying Sam definitely has valid fear for her safety at home and at work. So y'all are hitting on all the awesome points. And thank you, Kayla, for being willing to unmute and talk about those dynamics. So in this scenario, it seems pretty simple. And this person, Sam, has red in every single level. For the society, just like we said, we know that there's the potential. She could legally be fired if she's outed at work. The stigma and hypersexualization that was mentioned, no law to protect against revenge porn for adults. Also in the community, as you can tell, she seems very isolated. There's not a lot of mention of community or even relationships. The workplace might not be safe. There's also bi stigma, even in the queer community. With the relationships, once again, isolation. Also, the current romantic relationship that she is in is abusive, and there's a rising risk of escalation from that partner in abusive tactics, violent tactics. And so that exposure to that violence for this person is very high. Also, individually, there's economic strain. We hear that she's concerned about maybe having to live paycheck to paycheck and feeling threatened, personally feeling threatened and in danger. So as an advocate, some of the considerations we might need to consider is that, they have access, this person would have access to the same rights of someone who might want to break their lease to make sure that they are safer, making sure that we consider that for this survivor. Also, maybe access to a shelter. With that being said, if they need that shelter, also considering we need to have on hand a list of shelters that are queer friendly, queer trained, and queer safe. Because we also know that queer survivors in general, when they go into shelters, also experience high rates of sexual violence in those shelters as a queer person. Also, maybe even legal support services for their workplace anxiety, for that fear of if they're going to receive support or harm at work. And then lastly, if they truly feel like maybe they might need a new job opportunity, how do we partner with other agencies in the community to look for economic empowerment and opportunity for survivors who might need to transition to a new workplace if they're afraid of being outed? So also the legal support for potential images that might be shared out. So those are some of those dynamics to consider. So the last thing, why we put these scenarios up there, why we wanted to have case studies, is specifically survivors who are LGBTQ are asking for us to do this. They are telling us that our services are better and more trauma informed when we actually serve them the way they deserve to be served. So recently, UT put out a study, the IDVSA Institute put out a study, which is Survivors' Voices. And this was a quote directly from a queer identified survivor, where they said, beyond being empathetic and caring, survivors appreciated when hotline workers had high expertise in particular service areas. That's suicide, rape, domestic violence, queer support, or specialized experience working with certain populations. Once again, individuals, male survivors, queer folks. So our training around this and our work of monitoring our implicit biases is important as advocates and as a part of our work.
And so we are getting super close to time, but our last, walk away thought for us in terms of training on these things, and a place of it's like we get all these ideas from training. It's like one place, where can I start? And it's to offer some specialized training and not lumping together all of the community and saying, okay, I've been trained on this, LGBTQIA 2+ folks, so I know all the things about all the people, and really bringing out that, that connection of 1% of our dollars are being spent and training and learning on this and bringing that out. And that's one way to start. There's lots of bi visibility days and things like that, are other ways that we can make an impact too. And those are quick changes that don't require a lot of redoing in terms of our agencies and organizations.
So these are some of the citations. We can share these out. Crystal also has amazing resources. Also, Crystal sent me a new study last night that is from the CDC, new updated around survivorship.
So, yes, yes.
So that's all we have for y'all today. Really quick, can we give a huge round of applause, virtual round of applause for our interpreters? Can we thank them? Thank you so much for being patient with us as we, specifically me. But thank you, Crystal,
Yes,
for
thank you.
co-presenting.
Mhm.
Thank y'all for being here.
Yes, and one of the things we noticed in prepping for this presentation is that most of our state coalitions and things like this, there's only like 2 blog resources from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. So this is really as cutting edge information as we can possibly get. So if we can help train your organization with this content in any way, please feel free to reach out to SASA. We are a resource and we do want to be there to help y'all. So.
And if y'all have any questions, let us know. And I bet Melanie was about to mention the evaluation. Let us know how we can improve. Or if you have any
Yes.
resources that you're like, oh, this would be wonderful to add. Definitely. So I'll pass it over to Melanie to close us up.